Since the very beginning of the Demon Slayer story, the difference between the weak and the strong was made abundantly clear. In this world where wretched creatures known as demons rave and pillage, select few humans, in recognizing their own weakness, hone their skills with the sword and obtain incredible strength. But with this video, we will be covering the story of the strongest demon slayer of all time, and the one being Kibutsuji Muzan, the demonic progenitor himself, completely and utterly feared. To be clear, this video does contain information yet to be covered in the anime adaptation, so if spoilers aren't your thing, I suggest you exit from now. All colored pages were done in-house by us at Plot Armor, and we hope you enjoy the video. This is the story of Yoriichi Tsugikuni. The events of this tale took place over 400 years prior to the current Demon Slayer story. The life of Yoriichi began as the younger of two twin brothers, born into the household of a lord. At this time, twins were believed to be problematic in terms of succession and inheritance, but things were made easy for their father as the youngest child, Yoriichi, was born with a rather disturbing birthmark that laid across his forehead. And so the older child, Michikatsu, was dubbed his successor, whereas Yoriichi was sentenced to death. But with this decision, Yoriichi's mother fell into an unrelenting rage and would not allow the child to be killed. And so they came to the compromise that Yoriichi would live, but at the age of 10 would be sent off to a temple where he would dedicate his life to faith. And so with that, Yoriichi and Michikatsu, despite being identical twins, lived almost entirely different lives. From their rooms, clothing, education, and even the food that they consumed. Michikatsu was cherished, whereas Yoriichi was tolerated. Yoriichi, for the most part, always clung to his mother, but remained incredibly difficult to read, as since birth, he had never once smiled. And more than that, he never spoke. And so his mother, being a woman of great faith, prayed for the sun deity to shine warmly upon her son's deaf ears. And as a representation of this, she made a pair of earring charms for him. These charms being the very same pair that Tanjiro wears today. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Yoriichi's mother actually wasn't the only one who worried about him, as his older brother, Michikatsu, would often sneak into Yoriichi's tiny room just to play with him, which was actually pretty risky because if he were to be caught doing so or giving Yoriichi any of his things, then he would be reprimanded by their father with a severe beating. And so as a workaround, Michikatsu gave Yoriichi something he'd made himself, a small wooden flute. However, there wasn't much harm in observance, and so one day when Michikatsu practiced his sword swings in the family garden, a now 7-year-old Yoriichi stood beneath the shade of a pine tree as he uttered his first words. But although these were in fact the first words he'd ever spoken, he asked Michikatsu if it was his dream to become the strongest samurai in the nation, with perfect clarity. Now, Michikatsu, having all his life believed his brother to be deaf, in shock, dropped his wooden sword and gasped. And despite their parents' intentions to have him become a priest, Yoriichi continued with the declaration that he too desired to become a samurai, and in respect of his brother's dream, proclaimed his dream to become the second greatest samurai in the nation, and in the process, smiled for the very first time. After this, Yoriichi would go on to observe his brother's training with intentions of learning as well. And at the time, Michikatsu was being trained by their father's vassal, who, for the hell of it, gave Yoriichi a practice sword for fun, and even went as far as to give him simple instructions on how to hold it and such. From there, he urged the young boy to attempt to strike him as he himself assumed a fighting stance. And with that, in the blink of an eye, Yoriichi unleashed a series of 4 consecutive targeted blows to the neck, chest, stomach, and leg that not only flung the man in the air, but also left him completely unconscious. But despite this awe-inspiring display, from that moment onwards, Yoriichi denounced his dream of becoming a samurai, as the feeling of bringing harm to another person was simply unbearable to him. Now, Michikatsu, who had witnessed all this firsthand, was infinitely curious as to the secret of his younger brother's strength. And in response, Yoriichi described the contraction of the opponent's lungs, disposition of their bones, contraction of their muscles, and flow of their blood to be a roadmap of their movements, something that a young Michikatsu couldn't comprehend in the slightest. And so, to be clear, Yoriichi, on top of being born with a mark, was also born with the innate ability to see the transparent world. Both attributes being that which most Hashira wouldn't go on to possess until well into their lives, if ever. But once again, the way of the sword no longer interested Yoriichi. It was to the point where whenever Michikatsu would bring up the subject, Yoriichi would look incredibly bored and would much rather play board games and such. But even still, with this transgression, it wouldn't be long before the positions of the two brothers would inverse, with their father receiving word from his vassal of Yoriichi's strength. From here, Yoriichi was made to be his heir, and Michikatsu would be the one sent to the temple. But one night, sometime between 3 and 5 a.m., Yoriichi would visit Michikatsu, who had now assumed what was formerly his tiny room, with news of their mother's death. And it would be at this time that Yoriichi would also tell his brother of his departure for the temple. But he, at the very least, wanted to be able to say goodbye first, telling his brother that despite their distance, he wouldn't lose heart and will work diligently each and every day. All the while, cherishing the flute Michikatsu made for him as if it were his brother himself. And with that in mind, wrapped the flute in cloth and clung to it as if it were the most valuable treasure in the world. Yoriichi then bowed deeply to his beloved brother and departed, having taken barely anything with him. It was only after this that Michikatsu would discover that Yoriichi had left so that his brother wouldn't be robbed of his dream by being made into a priest in his stead. But also that the true reason Yoriichi had clung to their mother for so long was because due to her illness, she experienced difficulties on the left side of her body, and so he was actually supporting her all that time. Now, after leaving, Yoriichi simply yearned to run while admiring the beauty of the sky, and in doing so, ran for an entire day and night without a single moment's rest. But when he reached the mountains, he met a girl who stood unmoving with a bucket in her hands. Apparently, her family had all died due to a plague, leaving her all alone and understandably lonely. So to offset that feeling, she came to catch tadpoles to bring back home with her. But she remained standing there, unable to move. And as the sun began to set, she released the tadpoles from her bucket, feeling remorseful for separating them from their families. Yoriichi, seeing the sadness of this girl whose eyes resembled obsidian, decided to live with her. Her name was Uta, and she could talk from sun up to sundown. And it was actually through his conversations with her that Yoriichi realized that other people didn't see the transparent world as he did, allowing him to then understand why he had for so long felt distanced from others, going as far as to liken himself to a kite with a broken string. But Uta apparently held on to him firmly. 10 years later, and the two had married and were expecting a child to be born in the coming days. Because of this, Yoriichi set out to find a midwife, planning to do so before the sun set. But along the way, he encountered an elderly gentleman who, despite his heart complications, was making his way to visit his son, who had been fatally wounded in battle. Yoriichi, being the gentle soul that he was, assisted the man and brought him to his son, deciding to instead summon a midwife the following day, and decided to go back home. But night had arrived, and when he returned home, he was met with the chilling sight of his wife and unborn child who had been slaughtered. Having lost these lives he cherished more than his own, Yoriichi went on to cradle their bodies for 10 consecutive days. From there, a demon slayer in pursuit of a demon would come across this scene and convince Yoriichi to mourn them properly through prayer. And this demon slayer was actually the ancestor of the flame Hashira, Rengoku. You see, Yoriichi's dream at the time was to live a simple life with his family in a house so small that they'd sleep side by side, keeping so close that he'd always be able to see their beautiful faces. But unfortunately, in this beautiful world exist demons. And so it was from then on that Yoriichi would join the ranks of the Demon Slayers. And in doing so would change things forever by teaching them the breathing techniques. Yoriichi's sun breathing was that of legend, but wasn't necessarily suited for the bodies and skills of the various Hashira, who couldn't come close to matching him. And so it was for this reason that he tailored their tutelage to the original sword forms of flame, wind, water, thunder, and stone, which is where all the derivative breathing techniques we know of today come from. And it was also during his time as a demon slayer that Yoriichi would reunite with his brother by saving him from a demon who had slaughtered his subordinates. Yoriichi, having arrived late, apologized to his brother for not arriving sooner. After that, Michikatsu too would join the Demon Slayer. With their bolstered strength and forces, the mark would begin to spread, making them even more powerful. The golden age of Demon Slayers was upon them. But this prosperity wouldn't last very long, as marked ones began dying one after the other, as the mark apparently gave power in exchange for a person's lifespan. But even still, it wouldn't be long before Yoriichi came face to face with destiny, as he'd come across Kibitsuji Muzan himself. And it was in that very moment that Yoriichi believed himself to have been born to defeat him. Muzan's malice was sickening. Yoriichi described his presence to be like magma erupting from a volcano, as if the consumption of all was his primary directive. The two faced one another in a field of bamboo, and the only thing Muzan would say before striking was that he no longer had interest in swordsmen who used breathing techniques, making it pretty clear that the recent phenomenon had gained his attention at some point, but no longer, clearly unaware that he was in the presence of its creator. But with blistering speeds, Muzan displayed absurdly swift and long-reaching strikes that cut through bamboo as Yoriichi dodged. Immediately realizing that even a single scratch could kill him, Yoriichi, for the first time in battle, felt a chill run down his spine. The innards of this monstrosity were wretched. He had 7 hearts and 5 brains, so simply decapitating him wouldn't be enough. But with a dazzling series of motions, Yoriichi had completed the 13 sword forms of the sun and struck the human-shaped demonic scourge. And with that, Muzan was instantly split in half and had lost both arms. But with the stubs that remained, he desperately kept his severed head on his shoulders as he retched in pain and confusion as to why his limbs weren't regenerating, and his head wouldn't reconnect. And so, with Muzan in such a pitiful state, Yoriichi felt the need to ask him what the value of a life was to him, a question that Muzan would not answer. Instead, with anger, his face became beet red. With that, Yoriichi looked to the demon girl who had been accompanying Muzan that he didn't pay much attention to prior. She actually didn't attempt to aid the fallen Muzan at all. In fact, she looked to his battered state with hope and wonder in her eyes. Yoriichi decided that he'd deal with her after finishing Muzan. But when he stepped towards the man-shaped plague, Muzan's teeth began grinding violently, and in the next moment, Muzan's body broke apart with tons of force, and Yoriichi was quickly able to sense a total of 1,800 pieces of flesh, but was unfortunately only able to destroy 1,500. The remaining pieces were small, but enough to join together into a clump roughly the size of a human head. And with that, Muzan had escaped. At the sight of this, the female demon who remained fell to the ground and wailed with anguish, lamenting over how close Muzan was to destruction as she tore out her own hair with frustration. I mean, she wished that the monster had died so much in that moment that she cared not for the repercussions of his curse and screamed his name in anguish. Yet, she lived. She was free from Muzan's control due to his now severely weakened state. From here, Yoriichi asked her for her help in defeating him, to which she agreed. And this is a battle that she fights even to this day, as this demon girl was none other than Tamayo. Later that same day, Yoriichi would be informed by his fellow demon slayers that his beloved brother Michikatsu had become a demon. Now at this point, Yoriichi's brother, a fellow demon slayer recruited by his recommendation, was a demon. He had failed to defeat Muzan and had allowed Tamayo to escape, and so he was banished from the demon slayer corpse. His former comrades were so enraged, in fact, that they even suggested that he kill himself, which is something we know that other demon slayers would certainly do if a disciple or relative of theirs became a demon by choice. However, the leader of the demon slayer corps, who was at this time a newly appointed 6-year-old, would not allow such a thing to happen, and so Yoriichi simply left. For the rest of his life, Kibutsuji Muzan would actively avoid him out of fear, leaving Yoriichi with no pursuit, and so he decided to visit a friend he hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. This friend being Sumiyoshi, the ancestor of Tanjiro and Nezuko. Yoriichi was quite happy to see Sumiyoshi's family was doing well, as seeing the happiness of others made him happy. After telling Sumiyoshi pretty much his life story, Yoriichi expressed his belief that his strength was a blessing bestowed to him for the purpose of ending Muzan's reign of terror. But he was lacking, and he failed. And because of his failure, countless people would suffer from then on. And that pained him more than anything. Seeing Yoriichi in such pain was difficult for Sumiyoshi, as he had no idea what to say. But before he could think about it any longer, his 2-year-old daughter Sumire clung to the garb of Yoriichi and offered a hug. Yoriichi would then lift the small child up per Sumiyoshi's suggestion, and at the sight of the child's pure smile and laughter, tears began to stream from Yoriichi's face. As the sun shone and Sumiyoshi's wife Suyako returned home, Yoriichi clutched Sumire ever so gently as he continued to cry, quite possibly with thoughts of the dream he once had for his own family. Seeing this, Suyako too would console Yoriichi and offer him a meal. Later that day, upon Suyako's request, Yoriichi would demonstrate his 13 sword forms for the family, all of which Sumiyoshi would carefully watch and burn into his memory. Yoriichi's sun-breathing forms were of such grace and beauty that Sumiyoshi completely forgot to breathe. With a blade, Yoriichi favored spirit more than man. After this, Sumiyoshi urged Yoriichi to return someday, but before he left, Yoriichi gave his ear ornaments to Sumiyoshi, making it clear that he would never return. As he left, Yoriichi looked very sad, causing Sumiyoshi to cry. But he also yelled out to Yoriichi that because he had saved their lives in the past, that they would carry on his legacy, that despite what he may consider to be his failures, they weren't for naught, as he would pass on both the ear ornaments and sun breathing to their descendants. This notion bringing a smile from Yoriichi that resembled the rising of the sun across what was once the desolate night, as he said, "Thank you." Now, despite his mark and age, Yoriichi's final moments wouldn't come until far later, because at more than 80 years old, on the night of a red moon, a marked Yoriichi stood before his demonic brother Michikatsu, who is now known as Kokushibo, the strongest demon in existence besides Muzan himself. Upper Moon 1. Kokushibo stood there baffled and questioned how exactly Yoriichi, and Yoriichi alone, surmounted the price of the mark. But Yoriichi wouldn't answer. He instead began to cry and, in a hoarse voice, expressed his sympathies to his beloved brother. And because he had never seen such a display of emotions from his brother, Kokushibo stood there restless. But in the next moment, Yoriichi's sentimentality disappeared as he assumed an attacking stance. The air became heavy from Yoriichi's aura alone. There were absolutely no flaws in his stance despite his age, and just before moving, he warned his brother of his approach. And before Kokushibo could reach for his sword, Yoriichi had already cut his neck with power and speed no different from that of his prime. And with that, Kokushibo was certain that with the following strike, Yoriichi would cleave his head off. But that second strike would never come, as Yoriichi's life had come to an end as he remained standing. A flurry of emotions overwhelmed Kokushibo at the sight of this, because if Yoriichi's life was even a single breath longer, he too would have died. And so, in a totally blind rage, Kokushibo cut Yoriichi's already dead body in two, and in doing so, also cut in half the wooden flute only able to play a single note that he had once made for his younger brother Yoriichi. This flute having remained on Yoriichi's person for decades, even despite his brother having denounced his own humanity, a realization that left the demon in tears. He had been utterly defeated. Yoriichi was a man of peerless strength and grace that mirrored divinity, but in the end had lost those he cherished most of all, one way or another. But just as Sumiyoshi once said, his efforts weren't for naught, as even today, his acts still stand to support the demon slayers in their fight against the creatures of the night. And with that, this has been the story of Yoriichi Tsugikuni. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, because you can certainly expect more to come in the future. And with that being said, let us know which Demon Slayer character or concept you'd like us to cover next, because when it comes to bringing you some of the best Demon Slayer content on the platform, Plot Armor has you covered. As always, I am Slice of Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching, and have an awesome day. I love you.